a hearing session on the Wisconsin state budget for the next 2 years. We are very fortunate tonight to have with us Bob Lane, who is with the State Audit Bureau, Legislative Audit Bureau, Fiscal Bureau. He is so important that I can't even get his title done. Well, Bob has only been there since 1971. And so he's still new to the job. Actually, Bob is, I call him the guru. He knows everything about this budget. 1,079 pages. Literally can quote figures on memory. So we really are, and he's nonpartisan. The Audit Bureau is nonpartisan. So you're going to hear it straight out and no color to it. We're also very fortunate to have our senator here, Mark Miller, and I'm your state representative, Gary Hebl. I'm very happy with the turnout. We want this to be a listening session. We don't want you to listen to us. We want you to ask the questions. We want to listen to your concerns after you've asked the questions and try to answer as many of those questions as best we can. Understand that this budget was just provided to us within the last 2 or 3 weeks. So it takes a while to digest it, but you have been provided with an information sheet that kind of breaks down the budget in some detail. And actually today, was just released the budget in brief. So again, it's going to, we're having it televised or recorded videoly for transmission on our local access channel. We believe this information is extremely important. So what I'd like to do is, if anybody would like to start out, well, let's do this. Mark, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Well, thanks, Gary, and I appreciate being here, and I've enjoyed being the state senator for Sun Prairie since 2005 when I first ran for the state senate. The only thing I want to add is, one of them is that I've prepared some charts that indicate some things that both Representative Hebl and I feel are concerning about the past budget and the current budget. It's just a very small piece, but there are things that we think are a wrong direction for Wisconsin and that we would like to highlight as part of this listening session. And the other one is I have some hot news that I just learned in the last 2 minutes.
We have a new pope.
Oh no, you told me!
We have a new governor?
And that is that Gary talked about the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, which is by far the most respected state agency, or the legislative support agency when it comes to the budget. Their numbers and their projections are what both administration and the legislature relies on to be able to analyze the budget. And when they publish their analysis of the budget, we know that we're getting the straight scoop. There's no spin on it. It's just the straight numbers and facts. Because one of the things that is important for the Fiscal Bureau is not to provide an opinion about the benefit of any particular policy, but what is the impact on the budget and what might be its impact if it goes into implementation. So the news I have for you is that this afternoon, that analysis was published, and it's available on the website. You go to legislative websites, and you can find it yourself. And it is a plain language analysis of the state budget. And I just asked. I knew it was going to be coming up later this week, so I just asked Director Lang when it was going to be done. He said, "Well, we just delivered it this afternoon." So you learned it about the same time that I did. And if you have. If you want to understand more about the budget, that's the place to go. It's laid out in a way that you can easily understand. But the thing I wanted to point out, because we found that a number of people, this is not the first listening session that we've had in the district, but it's only the second one, or the third one actually, that Gary and I have had together, is that this chart over here on our left shows over the past several bienniums the amount of change in the per pupil spending that's been authorized by the state budget. And it generally goes up about $200 to $250 every biennium. to allow for the increasing cost of educating our students. When the Great Recession hit, you'll see there's that first dip there. That was under Governor Doyle's administration, when the revenues were just bleeding like crazy, and every part of the state budget had to take some hit. Now, we were able to backfill some of that loss with stimulus money, so it's not quite as dramatic as it looks. Then that steep cliff there is the cut in the per pupil spending that was in the last state budget, a $500 per pupil state budget. It was $1.6 million across the state. This chart over here shows, the blue line shows the progress in terms of the state economy. If Wisconsin had kept pace with the national economy, we kept pace with the national economy, the blue line indicates the amount of jobs we would have created. As you can see, early on in the Governor Walker's administration, we were maintaining pace with that, but we've rapidly fallen off since then. Now, I don't mean to embarrass Director Lyon, because he can't make any comments about that, but I think this was a dramatic indication of how we had misplaced priorities in the last budget. If we had kept pace with the national economic job creation, we would have had 90,000 new jobs in Wisconsin by this point. So, I think the policies that were put in place were misplaced. There needs to be some reflection of that in this current budget, but we'll proceed. We'll go along those lines. And because neither Gary nor I have had a chance to read the Fiscal Bureau paper, it's really good that we have the guy that wrote it here with us. So we look forward to your observations.
Go
ahead.
One other comment is that there is a handout with all the websites. Mark referred to the budget in brief from DOA, and the website is on this sheet, so everything that you need to know about the budget through the state offices is available through the website.
Do you have the Fiscal Bureau website on there? Here we go.
Yes, it's on there as well. So
okay.
Everything is covered with that. Bob, anything you'd like to say?
No, I'm just delighted to be here and looking forward to listening to your concerns or interest about the budget, and if I can respond to questions along with these two gentlemen, I'll be happy to do so. So thank you.
Well, let's open the floor then. To anybody who'd like to make a statement, comment, a question, feel free. This is informal. We want an exchange of ideas. So anybody have any questions about the budget? No one has a... Let's start with you, sure.
So,
maybe what you would, if you wouldn't mind, just state your name and you're from Sun Prairie, I assume.
Sun Prairie.
I don't.
There's a $500 or $500 million increase for transportation. Is that all out of the special funds for transportation, or is there, how much is from, if any, is from other than the segregated funds for transportation?
I've got the guy here that can answer that.
There's quite a bit of money that usually is in the general fund that is using to support transportation fund programs. I'll give you a couple. One is typically when we borrow money for transportation projects, the state pays that debt service with your automobile and truck registrations. You send your $75 in, you write a check to a fee trustee, and you send it to Milwaukee. Basically, we pledge automobile registration to pay off the bonds. It's called a revenue bond, okay? So there's quite a bit of revenue bond authority here, but the general fund is doing a couple of things. $200 million of bonds for the zoo interchange in Milwaukee. You know, where you drive in by the zoo before you get downtown. Major project. 200 million of bonds will be supported with the general fund to pay the debt service rather than the transportation fund. Another one is that mass transit funding, which is about $106 million a year for the mass transit systems throughout the state. State provides aids to local mass transit systems, and the federal government does. The state's commitment is $106 million. That has always been funded by the transportation fund. this budget flips that over in the second year of the biennium to be funded with the general fund. So that's a fairly significant policy decision that these folks are gonna have to decide, you know, who's funding mass transit. And then there's a couple of transfers. Right now, starting in the last budget, 1/4% of general fund taxes, basically income and sales taxes, is permanently transferred to the transportation fund. We collect about 14 billion a year in general fund taxes, so sort of do the math, it's about $36 million a year is transferred over to the general fund. And then there's another infusion, just a direct infusion of 23 million from the general fund into the transportation fund. So for, back a decade or so ago, the transportation fund was sort of bailing out or supporting the general fund. That's been flipped where it's sort of crossed now, where the general fund is doing more support for the transportation fund than the other way. But I hope that responds to your question.
If I make comment with regard, or, yeah, I'll make a quick comment, Bill, and then you can follow up. This budget really protects, enhances transportation and infrastructure. And in most cases, that's something I support. I think we do need a good quality transportation system. There's no question about that. My concern is the priority that this budget takes. My priority, and I believe Mark's as well, Senator Miller, I'll let him speak to that, but our priority is education. Let's take care of education as our #1 priority. Healthcare would be #2 in our estimation, and certainly transportation is an important part of the budgetary process. This budget prioritizes to where transportation becomes the #1 priority under the budget. And Bill, you had a follow-up.
Two other ones were, because it seemed like I heard the state was gonna increase the amount of borrowing. Would that affect their, the interest rate that they have to pay on their loans that they're gonna incur? And then third, kinda interested in the taxes. And I noticed rather than just taking that cut out of the lower bracket, which would affect everybody automatically, because first bracket, you know, you pay that, and then if you earn more, you get affected by the second bracket and so forth. Why didn't they just take the cut out of the lowest bracket instead of spreading it up into the higher brackets for those people that weren't hurt by the cuts as much?
Bob, would you care to address those two questions? Let me do the bonding one. Right now in the budget, there's about $1 billion of bond authorization. So bonding is just like taking out a mortgage. You go to a bank and the bank gives you money and you pay debt service and pay principal and interest over some period of time. The state does that basically for concrete, either horizontal roads or buildings, vertical concrete. We're limited to what we can borrow money for. We can't borrow money to pay our salaries or operating purposes. The Constitution is pretty tight about that. There's $1 billion right here. We haven't seen the capital budget, which is building projects. We've seen the road budget, but not the university buildings and other things. Interest rates, you look at bonding, in part the state bonds, let's take a road, for example. Rather than paying cash for it, we borrow money and we pay it off over 20 or 30 years, depending on the life of the road. And the concept is that rather than those of us in this room paying today for a 30-year road, we have taxpayers over the next 30 years pay for it through debt service. And the interest rates are really low. I mean, we get very low interest rates. And so it's not you have to watch how much you borrow and how much you have to pay off in the future, but it's not a bad thing to borrow money at these kind of rates. It's sort of like a home mortgage. If you can get a 3%, 30-year mortgage or something, that's a lot better than what was happening 10 or 15 years ago. So borrowing's not necessarily bad. I think you just have to watch how much of your operating budget has to go off to pay that, okay? And then your second question, on on the tax cut, and you made a good observation. Let me, we have five income tax rates, and then, or 5 income tax brackets, and then we have 5 rates. So let me just take a married joint, okay, just to give you some idea. So, these are taxable income. So our lowest bracket is from 0 to 14,300. So on the first 14,300, the tax rate is 4.6% currently, and under the governor's bill, it goes to 4.5. Then our next bracket goes from 14 to 28,000, and the rate goes from 6.5 to 5.94. The third bracket is really huge. It goes from 28,000 up to 215,000 of income. And that rate is 6.5, and it goes down to 6.36. So a person there, on the first 14,000, you get a little lower rate, and then on the next 14,000 up to 28, you get a lower rate, and then up to the 215,000, your rate goes down. Then our two top ones are roughly 215,000 to 315,000, $100,000 spread. The tax rate 6.7%. That stays the same, and then our top rate is 315,000 and over, and that's 775. What the governor did was he cut the first 3 rates in those brackets. So everybody who's got taxable income gets some tax break, because everybody's got income at the lowest level, most have at the next level, but then when you get into that wide third level, then you're reaching up into, taxable income up 200,000 or so. So with this gentleman, the average tax cut, I think, is about $83, okay? But it goes up in a couple hundred, $200+ at the higher income ranges, because there are a number of people that are in that third bracket. What this gentleman's saying is, what if we only cut the lowest 2 rates on the lowest 2 brackets? You get the same average, because if you spend $170 million a year, but then you're finding it's really compressed, so that rather than having a spread of, maybe $20 to $250, you're compressing the tax decrease more around the average of the $80. And so you're lifting up some at the lower end and bringing some down on the upper end if you only affect the lowest bracket or the lowest 2 brackets. I don't know, that might, I don't know, is that clear at all or not? But I think you understand, your question is.
The way I see it is that somebody in the 5th bracket still pays taxes on their first 14,000 at, 4.5%, and so forth up. But I would assume, because there's no cuts I see a really bad thing in Wisconsin was the earned income that rewarded people for working, and now you're saying you don't care if you're working. Is that?
Yeah,
that would be the
earned income
message.
debt credit is gone.
Why not, instead of, I thought it'd be almost better if they didn't have the earned income tax credit and they did it with the tax rates, by lowering those people that are, below the median income for the people in the state.
If you took, for example, let me just take something at like 40,000 and over, okay, 40,000 of taxable income. So under the governor's plan, a person in 40 to 50,000, their tax reduction, married filing jointly, would be $45, and it would go to 303 as you go up. So anybody over 300,000 would get $303 deduction, and where I started at 40 to 50 would get 45. And what you're talking about on that 40 to 50 range is you just did those bottom rates. The 40 to 50,000 person would get a $102 tax cut, and the 300,000 and over would get a $103 tax cut. And all the way up and down, they're almost identical to about $102 to $103. It's just the effect of at what bracket do you cut the rates.
I guess I prefer Dreyfus' way of doing it, that somebody like, you know, get the cuts to people that are, you know, want hurt.
You know, an interesting thing that I learned about the earned income tax credit is that there was recognition at the time when there was recognition that low income earners were paying a higher percentage of income in terms of Social Security, Medicaid, and so forth than higher income taxpayers were. And so the earned income tax credit did two things. One of them was it helped to offset the economic impact of those payroll taxes, and secondly, it provided an additional incentive to work. And as Ronald Reagan said, it was one of the best programs that we've implemented to try and establish some kind of income equity for low-income workers. And so I don't disagree with you at all about the benefits of the tax credit for low-income workers. What happened in the last budget, of course, that was cut, and so the benefit of that tax credit was reduced. And it seems like there was always a lot of enthusiasm for tax credits as long as they were for corporations or businesses or high-income people, but there seemed to be the same kind of enthusiasm for tax credit for low-income people. One other observation, and that is that if you provide lower tax rates for middle-income people, high-income people are going to benefit from that because they pay taxes at that same rate for those particular rates. And as a consequence, but one of the consequences of that is most of the benefit goes to people with high income because they're filling all of that particular bracket with income. So most of the dollars that are saved from that actually go to high income people. Another way of doing it would be to create a new tax bracket for higher income people. That's what happened in Governor Doyle's last budget. Is he added a new tax bracket and added an additional 1% tax to the highest tax bracket. In this budget, there's no change to that highest tax bracket. It was not reduced. All the other tax brackets are reduced, and so the governor has some justification for saying that he's provided a middle income tax reduction because he has reduced the rates on all except the highest rate.
Ma'am, you had a question, I believe. Please.
I have several questions. One thing I wanted to ask about the food share job training. If people participate in job training, do they continue to receive their food share? Or is it they have to, and who administers the job training? Are they find that themselves or what are they looking at?
Sue, I don't know the answer to that.
That's an excellent
But
question.
Bob's is gonna go through these papers and try and see if he can find the answer for it. Do you have another question?
Yeah, I do. One is just kind of a purely political question. I'm wondering if the Joint Finance Committee, with some of the Republican senators saying that they are going to support the voucher school expansion, if that's likely to get reconfigured. And then today there were people at the Capitol calling for a reduction in the prison population down to 11,000 by 2015. I'm wondering if there's any realistic possibility for finding funds to do anything in reducing the prison population.
Well, I'm gonna answer the prison population one first, and Bob, you nudge me if you found the answer to that first question about the food share job training. And if you want to talk about vouchers, sure, Gary. But it's very, yeah.
I just have a couple of editorial comments that have. One is that back when Governor Thompson reduced AFDC funding by a third, he increased state staff to oversee the program. Sounds as if Governor Walker is doing the same thing and increasing state staff to oversee food share and these programs. That's one way of creating jobs. And another one is that I read this last year that the earned income tax credit was actually created by the National Republican Party to soften the image of Senator Goldwater when he was running for president, because he had been so opposed to the war on poverty, and they needed to have a program that made him appear to want to help low-income people. So it's a switch, a flip from opposing the EITC, because it was originally a GOP program. I know Representative Petri was very supportive of that. So I think the Republicans need to remember their history and where that program came from, and maybe reconsider their support for it.
Thank you, Sue, and I think it's pretty widely recognized that if Ronald Reagan was a governor or was running for office, or had been in office, he'd probably be primary today because he's too liberal. The reason I want to answer the question about the prisons is back in the 2000, I think it was the 2009 budget, we implemented a program called Earned Release. This was, it was widely recognized that the fixed sentences that had been implemented a decade earlier were not working very well in the prison population, because there's no incentive for somebody to try to conform the behavior in order to get released. So we implemented with the Department of Corrections an earned release program, whereby following certain steps, either with counseling or job work or whatever, you could earn credits toward an early release. And this helped the corrections officers to be able to help maintain discipline within the prison community, because it provided a goal and an incentive for prisoners. And in the first year of that operation, it saved, I don't know the exact amount, but it can save a considerable amount of money. That program was eliminated at the beginning of this administration. But the interesting thing was they booked the savings based on the number of the reduction in prisoners. For the first time in decades, we actually reduced prison population in Wisconsin. And so those savings were booked, but then they eliminated the program that created the savings, and so now our prison population is increasing all over again. I mean, it's a classic example of ideology trumping common sense, and that's what happened on the corrections. And I forget exactly what your question was on the prisons, but I thought that response responded somewhat to your concerns.
Well, I didn't attend the lobby day, but I'm wondering what the groups promoting this are asking for a source for the funding. I mean, they're asked for the money, I think 82 million, to begin to fund the kind of the shift in how corrections works.
Well, the point about the earned release is it actually reduced costs. You have fewer people in prison. The cost for keeping a prisoner in prison for a year is something like $30,000 a year, and the cost of monitoring on parole is much less. It's like $6,000 or even less, depending on the conditions of the parole. And so we were making progress going in the right direction in terms of reducing our prison population, getting people back onto the streets where they can find a job and support their families if they have a family. And so that kind of program doesn't require additional funding. You know, what requires additional funding is putting more people back in prisons again. So I'm not familiar with this particular advocacy group that you're talking about that was advocating for more money to reduce prison populations. What they may have been doing was advocating, and correct me if I'm not guessing correctly, they might have been advocating for better support services once people get out of prison, so that they don't recidivate. That might have been it.
It's called the 11 by 15 campaign.
Yeah, they did hit all of our offices at the Capitol, and it's an excellent idea. I have not seen the information that they've dropped off. My staff informed me that they did come in today. Clearly, our prison population is double the size of Minnesota's. Similar population, similar crime rate. Why is ours twice? Wisconsin people aren't that much worse than Minnesota people. Frankly, I think they're a lot better. We have a couple of problems there. One is we have truth in sentencing. We also have the issue of 3 strikes and you're out. These are a couple of policies that we're going to get tough on crime, and we're going to put people in prison and throw away the key, and then we'll have a lot safer streets. The logic there is weak, because as Mark indicated, it costs 30 grand a year to house these people. It's one of the, we actually pay as much for our prison population as we do, I believe, for our secondary and technical education. I mean, it's a big part of our budget. So this idea makes a lot of sense. We also need to spend money on treatment so that when these prisoners, these lawbreakers, come out, they're not going to commit the same crimes or other crimes again. So that's part of the process of improving the outcome. Really where we need to start is on the front end with education. We need to work with the school system to make sure that our dropout rate is no longer 50% or better in Milwaukee and other large cities. We need to correct that problem. And that's where our emphasis is in terms of making sure that our schools work and we properly fund those schools. I applaud this idea and other ideas with regards to enhancing the ability not only not to go to prison, but if people have jobs, they have an education, they have a much better chance of getting work and staying up. You know, in Milwaukee, 75% of the black males between 18 and 25 do not have a driver's license or a high school education. Now that's just a problem that's beaming with, you know, how do you make money? You can't leave your community. All you can do is get into drugs, get into gangs. I mean, it's a problem that we need to solve because we're going to share in the cost and we need to work on those kind of issues. And I see the answer through our educational system. And it needs to be improved on, and I believe that that money needs to be spent there to make sure that does occur. Now, your second question dealt with vouchers. And you see in your handout, we have a $94 million increase in funding for private vouchers. That's a 29% increase. That's $1,400 per student. There's 2,500 children, 25,000 students in the voucher program. That's what the estimate is to be. There's no increase in our public schools. We have 870,000 public school children. And the increase really amounts to a 0 per pupil increase. Now, after a cut of $1.6 billion last biennium, you hear people on the street saying, well, you know, the schools are still going. They're still functioning. You know, maybe it wasn't such a bad idea. But I'll tell you that schools, you don't see it. It's not an immediate thing. But in 8 years, 10 years, you're going to hear people say, what happened to our schools? It's just like the mining bill up north that we just passed. You know, we want to trade the environment for jobs. And I'm all for jobs, but I'll never trade our beautiful environment or take the risk of contaminating our water for jobs. Because one of the representatives on the other side said, well, you know, if it's not quite right, we'll fix it. That's not how the environment works. Once you pollute the environment, it doesn't all of a sudden, the next day, well, we'll fix it, it's good again. And education is the same way. We have worked so hard in this state to establish a good quality education for every single one of our students. And to see these kind of cuts on the K through 12 level, I mean, we're going to see it, and we're going to see it to a point where we're going to say, wow, did we make a mistake? And I hope we realize it before we've gone too far, because education is our future.
Gary?
Sue, to directly answer your question about will there be modifications to the governor's proposal in the budget in terms of vouchers, because some key members of the majority party have indicated reservations about the proposal, I think there will be modifications, but I can't predict where they are. Senator Olson, who's the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, has floated he thinks there should be a $150 per pupil increase in the levy limit. Representative Castel, who chairs the Assembly Education Committee, has indicated he doesn't think that there should be the expansion of vouchers the way that the governor has proposed. And I think Senator Ellis, who is the president of the Senate, has also indicated reservations about the expansion. The fact that these key Republicans have been willing to be public about their reservations, I think indicates that there's going to be a modification, perhaps a significant modification to the governor's proposal, that there's other members of the majority caucus who feel reservations. But that is me reading tea leaves, it's not me knowing anything in particular. Now, Bob has a response to your first question about the food share job training.
Just real quickly, there's a provision in the budget that would allow the Department of Health Services to implement work requirements for participation in the food share program. Basically, people between the age of 18 and 50, able-bodied folks there. It's not a mandatory program at this point. It just says the department has the ability to implement one. I think, although it's not in the bill, I think they're thinking about doing it in Racine, Kenosha, and Walworth counties to try it by like July of 14, to be roughly 15 months from now. And then maybe go into 3 other areas and potentially statewide by January of 15. But I think we'll just have to wait and see if they implement it, and if they implement it in that fashion.
Yes,
On the voucher program, how can anybody on any level of government force taxpayer money to fund private schools, which might include religious teachings and maybe some other teachings that aren't favorable to people as taxpayers? Doesn't that conflict with the Constitution?
the way it works, the way they got around the Constitution is to provide a voucher to a family. So the money is not paid to the school, it's paid to the family, and then the family decides where that money is being spent. So,
The other provision is that the family can spend it in the voucher school, provided that the voucher school does not provide religious training to the student as part of the curriculum, as part of their curriculum that's undergoing. They can provide religious training, but not the part that is supported by the voucher. So they can do it like after school or like that.
one follow-up to that as well, with regards to the voucher program in this state. The last 3 speakers of the Wisconsin legislature are now lobbyists for voucher schools. Jeff Fitzgerald, John Gard, and Scott Jensen, all are lobbyists for voucher schools. So, they're making a lot more money there than they were in the legislature. We've got bills pending. We want to prevent legislators from going into lobbying for at least 2 years after they leave the legislature. We think that's absolutely wrong. That
And will
occurs.
private schools that are on the list to be chosen be required to meet the same requirements as public education?
Currently, no, but we're working on making them accountable and making sure that if in fact we're going to spend this kind of money, we better make sure that those schools toe the line. They're currently not at the same requirements as the public schools.
Right, you know, I think a family should have every right to be able to enroll their children in a private school. But if they're going to accept public money to enroll their kids in public school, then that public school, or I mean in a private school, that private school needs to meet certain requirements to ensure that public money is well spent. And so issues of accountability and so forth are totally appropriate. But they're not currently in the law. You're right.
I mean, you know, I see the students who are incapacitated being able to pick and choose the students that these public or private schools want to take. Oh, you know, public schools have to deal with all kinds of students, and they have to make accommodations for these students. Can a private school just says, oops, we don't happen to have the proper accommodations, so we can't take this student?
Sure.
Valid point?
Nick? By the way, I should introduce her. We do have a couple of elected officials here. I see Alderman Russ Fossbender just walked in. Welcome, Russ, city representative. And Nick is a county board supervisor from this district as well. So Nick, go ahead.
I'm also a teacher at DeForest High School. And could you guys just maybe explain the difference between a charter and a voucher? Because those two words are used loosely a lot, and as a teacher, I'm always afraid that maybe sometimes the general public doesn't really get the difference between the two. So when elections and stuff like that come up, I think that we need to do a better job of educating people on what that difference is. And then if Bob could talk about, you know, I know they're in the budget, Madison would be another city that would be, would succumb to vouchers, and if you could tell us what the impact would be on the Madison public school budgets if that happens, just so that people in Sun Prairie, you know, and I want to applaud our school board. They just sent a letter from the Sun Prairie School District, our school board did, to say that they weren't supportive of the voucher system in the budget. So I'm happy our school board did that. But if you guys could talk about those two things.
Sure, and I'm going to defer to Director Lang. I think that he's had to give this explanation before, and I think he'll give one that'll be the most informative.
There's two kinds of charter schools, okay? There are charter schools that are established by a school board, and then are public schools within the school district. I don't know if Sun Prairie has a charter school or not. I don't know. You might have, I don't know.
The alternative high school may be
Okay.
a charter school.
So there are a number of school districts in the state that have, for, you know, whatever reason, a special group of children, or they want a special type of curriculum, whatever, will then set up a charter school within that school district. But it's a public school. They're funded with state dollars, and kids are counted like they are in any other school. So it really is a part of the public system. Then we have another group of charter schools called independent charter schools, and they operate in Milwaukee and in Kenosha. And the entities that sponsor them are University of Milwaukee, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, the City of Milwaukee can, or the Technical College in Milwaukee can. Those three can sponsor independent charter schools. These schools are funded with state dollars, and the way it's funded is every school district's aid is reduced. This year it's like 1.4% of what your aid entitlement is. So all 425 school districts are funding those independent charters operated by basically UWM and the Parkside campus down in Kenosha. Those are the charters. The choice schools, our Senator Miller was mentioning, is where, and it is in two places right now, Milwaukee and Racine. Racine started last year. So Milwaukee has about, I think, there's about 22,000 kids that are that are voucher students. There's a situation where a student can enroll in a voucher school. The income limit, there's an income limit that's 300% of federal poverty level, which right now for a family of four is about $69,000 a year, are eligible for the choice program. The parent makes a decision to have their child go into one of these non-public schools. So some are religious schools, some are non-religious organized. I'm gonna guess, but I'd say we probably have somewhere around 90 or so or 100 choice schools in the Milwaukee area. And in the last budget, the Racine School District, people in the Racine School District were given the opportunity to participate in choice at a limited enrollment number. Now, what the governor's budget does, there was also a provision in a budget, but it was taken out to expand it, that would have been to Green Bay. That didn't happen in the last budget session. The governor's budget would basically allow choice to expand, and there's 9 districts that are potentially affected. Beloit, Fond du Lac, Green Bay, Kenosha, Madison, Sheboygan, Superior, and Waukesha and West Dallas. West Dallas, West Milwaukee is one school district, so I think there's 9 there. They're selected because there's a sort of a grading system by school in the state, not by district, but by school. And so the governor's criteria is twofold for expansion. One, the district has to have 4,000 pupils, so these 9 have at least 4,000 pupils. And 2, they have to have 2 schools within the district that were on the low end of the report card. For whatever reason or whatever school, didn't matter if it was an elementary school or middle school, high school, whatever. So there are 9 that qualify. Now in the first year, this would go into effect, it's limited to 500 students in those 9, okay? And I think the superintendent of public instruction got to figure out how that allocation goes. Then the second year, it goes up to 1,000. A district, first of all, qualifies by meeting these criteria, or they become eligible, and then they qualify if there are 20 students within the district who want to participate in a choice program. But it is an expansion. Madison is one of them, and again, as Senator Miller and one of the questioners said, I think there are people who are clearly looking at the expansion and looking at the whole voucher program. So this is a big, big thing in the state's budget. There's no question about it, and I think it will get some scrutiny. I have no idea what the outcome will be, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
For example, the Monona Grove School District adjacent to us here has a district-run charter school. And it's primarily, I think, designed to serve students who are not succeeding in the regular school system, regular school environment. But it's run by the school district.
And isn't it proven many times over that private schools don't even do as well as public schools in many cases, teaching the children?
There's surveys that show that. It depends on who's taking the survey many times.
Is
and
our
what
governor a privately school educated man?
questions.
These kids are in the One of the things that I've observed is that in the public school system, there are good schools, there are excellent schools, and there are poor schools. In the voucher school system, the private school system, there are excellent schools, average schools, and not so good schools. And the surveys that I've read basically show that the academic outcome results are the same in the public school and in the private school system. But you know, the private school system includes a bunch of very top-notch parochial schools also, particularly over on in Milwaukee and Racine area. The challenge, but it's not exactly like you're comparing apples to apples, since, as you indicated in an earlier question, is the private schools are not required to take all comers, the children with developmental disabilities and so forth. And so, there's some question, are you really comparing apples to apples? But even if you're not, the outcomes are still the same. Where I think the focus needs to be, and part of the reason behind the impetus for sending kids to private school is where a person lives in a school service area where the school is not performing well, and they want to have the best for their kid. And so they may say, well, I can't move because my job is here, or I can't afford to move because this is the only place where I can afford housing. They're looking for some alternative for getting their kids a better chance in the future, and all of us can relate to that. But I think the focus needs to be on continued improvement of our public education school system, and we are struggling with how to do that in a way, because oftentimes these issues are much bigger than the school system. It has to do with the neighborhood and the community in which it's located.
There's $21 million, you talked about special needs students, there actually is a $21 million item for special needs vouchers. So the plan is to expand voucher schools around even special needs children. So I think that's a concern that we all have to look at. How far is this going to go and where is the end? Yes, Mary?
But be very careful about that, because what I understand is, even if those vouchers are given for special needs students, they may not necessarily have to carry the individual education plan to that vouchered school,
Right.
which puts those kids with disabilities at a tremendous disadvantage.
There's a huge opposition from the disability advocates to this provision, just huge. I mean, they're just definitely afraid of what this will mean in terms of
Absolutely.
providing access to education for children with disabilities.
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Marion. Let Marion.
I do have a question, and I asked Mr. Lang this 2 years ago as well. How much in this budget is policy questions that should be taken out of the budget, and how much is just budget issues that should be kept in the budget? I mean, certainly vouchers are a policy.
It's 1,100 pages, so there's. Well, one of the things that we do in our office is we go through the budget, and it's an exercise that we're going through over again, to identify things that are non-fiscal policy items that don't relate to the budget. But the criteria that we would use would be, it's been a subject of legislation in the past, separate legislation, not budget legislation. It's the policy implications, even if there's fiscal implication, the policy implications outweigh the fiscal implications. It's a significant policy item. Those are sort of two of the big ones, and there's a few others. We put a list together and give it to a number of legislators, but to the co-chair of the Joint Committee on Finance. And they will go through the list and make a decision that whatever items we have should or shouldn't be included in the budget. So I don't make the call, I provide the list, okay? And so I can't tell you, what we're gonna have on the list, what will be, what won't be. But I'll give you, let me give you an example of one. And again, I don't know if it'll be there or not, but there's a provision in the bill that would prohibit residency requirements for local employees of the state. So it's a huge issue in the city of Milwaukee, because right now, Milwaukee has residency requirements. So they've got roughly 3,900 police and people on the police and fire departments, sworn officers and, firefighters, et cetera, who now live within the city, have to live in the city of Milwaukee. And the same applies for the Milwaukee Public School system, that they have to live. There are a number of municipalities that have residency requirements for their employees. Okay, so it's an issue in the budget that would prohibit the residency requirement. Whether it's a local issue, rather than a state issue. So I mean, we're just beginning to look at it, but that's something that we look at. And there are some others on selling land to aliens and foreign companies or foreign individuals that's there, and so there are just a number of things that are going to be there. I think that the thing about the budget, it's the only bill that's guaranteed passage. I mean, the Constitution doesn't say these guys have to pass the budget, but it is, because there's so much in it, and there's so many aids to local governments, et cetera, there's always enough pressure that the budget is going to pass. So some folks think, I can't get a separate bill passed, I'll try to have it pass through the budget. I think looking at it from the organization and the function of the legislature, I think there are items, and this is my personal philosophy, items in the budget that the Finance Committee should deal with, and there are items that standing committees of the legislature should debate at greater length and have more input into. The legislature's strength is in the committee process, and the more individuals in the legislature that can be involved in reviewing some of those matters, I think it benefits the legislature as a body. So we have tried over many, many years to identify, and we have received support. Senator Miller was the chairman of the Finance Committee at one point and was receptive to and went through the list and removed a number of things that were there and send them out to other committees. Our judgment is not whether this is a good item or a bad item. It's, is this the vehicle, or should there be another vehicle to have it go through?
Thank you.
Yes,
So it was mentioned that there's a nominal difference between the voucher schools and the public schools. There are, of course,
In terms of performance.
right, and there are, of course, studies, good 5-year studies that indicate that there are leaps and bounds being made by these voucher schools, and noticeably at certain grades. And then, so I would like to put out to you as a question, isn't it a fact that we are also looking at 5,000 on the average student savings from the voucher schools versus the public schools, which is like a 30% less cost per pupil than in the public schools? Is that what you are familiar with?
I think my comment that I said earlier is that there are public schools that are excellent, public schools that are adequate, and some that are not so good. Same thing we found in voucher schools, and that my philosophy is to continue to work to continually improve public schools, because they have to take all students, and all our students deserve to have access to a good public education. And I support the idea of equalization, so that in communities that are property tax poor, there's a greater share of state support for those students, so that they have that same kind of access. They're not hampered by the lack of funds. They may be hampered by the community that they live in and the opportunities that are available for them, but they're not hampered by the lack of funds. And I think when the legislature and the governor, and I don't know when that happened, maybe Bob probably remembers, is to make the case for equalization of education, that was a very sound piece of public policy. It means that here, that school districts here in Dane County get less money, because we are relatively wealthy. The school districts here are property wealthy compared to school districts in most of the rest of the state. And people may complain about that, but in fact, I think that's good public policy. The issue with that, in fact, it costs the state, the cost to the state in terms of the voucher amount is lower than the average per pupil amount that we provide in state aid. So there's a difference there. But one of the things that happens is that the amount of money available to our public school system is decreased by the fact that there's no longer a student that counts for that state aid. So you're reducing the amount of state aid available to the public school system, because that student has transferred over and is now in a private school system. And so we are making it increasingly difficult for the public school system to succeed, because we have not provided them any way to make up that difference. We've imposed a levy limit on the school district, so the only way that they can respond to the reduction in state aid is to reduce their academic program or cut costs somewhere else in the program. So in fact, the students are getting the quality of the education available to them is less. And when you've had the kind of cut that we show over here, this dramatic cut, it basically required the school districts to make up the difference by the increased contributions from the teachers and the school district employees. But there was not enough available for them to do that. So that resulted in a reduction in the resources available to educate all of our students.
Isn't it true that in the governor's budget, the cost per student that Wisconsin spends, the adjustment to that cost per student that you're referencing still leaves Wisconsin in the top 10 paying per student spending?
Right, and I think that's the reason that we have had for generations invested in our public school system. And we have seen the benefits of that in terms of that our students do very well on the standardized testing, the ACT, the college testing. And my children benefited from that. I want my grandchildren to benefit from that same kind of investment. Gary and I and you and the people in this room all benefited from our parents and grandparents investing in public education. but our grandchildren deserve that same kind of investment. I do not want to see us be average. I want to see us stay in the top 10. I'd like to see us be in the top number 1, and that requires an investment. It is not okay by me to have just a mediocre public education system.
One of the most important things in a community where someone's coming to they think about living in Sun Prairie, one of the first questions they ask is, what's the quality of the schools? One of the reasons that Sun Prairie is one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing cities in the state of Wisconsin is because of the quality of our schools. We really are second to none. Our priority is good quality education. Sun Prairie passed the largest referendum in the history of the state of Wisconsin to build a new high school, $95 million. We feel education is our future, and we prioritize that as our number 1 concern. There was a question, yes?
I have 2 thoughts regarding education that I just wanted to express. The first is what this comes down to for me is the issue of accountability with the charter schools and with the choice schools. I think there are a place for those schools in the larger educational system, but if we're demanding accountability and results from our public schools, as I think we should, then by all rights and reason we should demand that same accountability from any other schools that are obtaining or receiving those public funds. And it concerns me, especially in areas like Milwaukee, where there are schools that are failing. In Madison, there are some schools that are failing, that only children from families of means then have access to other methods of education. So in that sense, I think that it is incredibly important to have a strong voucher system in place when it makes sense. And so one of my primary concerns is the fact that it's now being opened up to that entire district versus students in those areas where the schools themselves are actually failing and are not living up to expectations. So that's my primary concern. I also have a problem with the fact that we're not then giving those funds to those schools to improve the education at those schools, and we're so much of the funding for the schools now is going to be determined on their results and on their outcomes, and I just don't see the wisdom in reducing funds to schools that aren't doing well. I'm not sure. I think there's an idea from the governor's office that's going to motivate the schools to perform better, but realistically, and as you said before, Senator Miller, a lot of times it has to do with that community, and with everything else going on there, simply taking that money away isn't going to get us the results that we need. Secondly, I think we are very fortunate in the city of Sun Prairie to have such strong schools, and I'm one that always happily votes in favor of increases to the tax levy, because I have no problem paying more if I'm going to see the kind of results in our school system that we've seen here in Sun Prairie, because the teachers I've dealt with by and large have been fantastic. The administration is great to work with. I am concerned, however, with some other teachers I've spoken with in districts outside of this area, where new teachers are coming into the district and making $32,000, $35,000, $37,000 a year. The automatic step increases have been removed. The idea being that we want to see results and base increases on merit. There isn't funding to do that. There's no merit system in place. No district wants to be the first one to try to impose some sort of merit system. So I think new teachers coming into the community now, if they don't get that full inflation increase through their union negotiations, they're going to see their purchasing power actually decrease over time. And for a lot of kids and young adults and teachers, again, entering that profession, I don't think it's a sustainable track anymore from a financial standpoint. And that's a primary concern I have, because I think there are communities where they don't value education the same way we do in Sun Prairie, or at least won't commit their tax dollars to it the same way we will. And I hate to see those districts and those children not being given those same types of opportunities.
If I may respond, a couple of things. We had these listening sessions. On Monday, we had a listening session in Cottage Grove for the Monona Grove School District, and also on Monday night later on at the Stoughton Opera House for the Stoughton School District. And what we found in both those school districts, as well as here in Sun Prairie, is that many of those school districts have budgeted well, have a rainy day fund to accommodate situations where there would be a downturn in revenue or an increase in expenditures unexpected. And those rainy day funds, if you will, have been depleted. We are now getting to the point, and we're now going to see in these next 2 years some serious budget cuts to some very important programs within our educational system. So to think that this $1.6 billion cut 2 years ago has no ramifications is a joke. And the fact that there's not a dollar increase in public education with this budget scares the daylights out of me. Bottom line is that we're going to see those reductions upcoming. I introduced 4 teachers in home ec at the Capitol in our last session. And they talked about, of their 150 programs within the state of Wisconsin, 60% of them saw serious cuts with this last budget. 60% loss of, definitely loss of staff, teachers, loss of programming already. So that's what's going to happen. And we can say, and you hear it on the street, our kids are still getting a great education. Well, it's going to come to a time, like you talk about. I mean, I hear people saying, I'm no longer going to go into teaching because I love it. I would be a great teacher, but I can't make a living. I can't afford to raise a family at $30,000, $32,000 a year with no step increases. What are we doing? We're bankrupting our educational system. A huge mistake, and we need to turn that tide before it becomes even worse. Thank you for your comments.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's, I look at public services, they're not necessarily fitting in the business model, and that is that if you, I don't think that people that provide public services such as education or public safety or firefighter necessarily are incented by being able to compete for some additional money. In the case of scarcity like we have now, there may be some incentive for that, but I think what really motivates people who enter into public service is the satisfaction of providing good public service. And I spent 30 years in the Wisconsin Air National Guard as a military pilot. And, you know, we never got any incentive for being the best in the, any financial incentive for being the best fighter pilot or being the best unit. And this Madison unit routinely was one of the best in the country. But we competed hard and worked hard because we were proud of our unit, and we were proud to be continually recognized as one of the best in the country. And I think the same is true of school districts, is that they would compete much harder if there's an opportunity for them to be recognized as one of the best in the country. And one of the things that is good about that is that units, in the case of the military or other schools that are not as successful, can look to the practices of the more successful schools to see how those can translate into their administration and their scholastic environment. So the small amount that's available there as incentives in this current budget, I think is somewhat misplaced. I do agree with the fact of providing additional money for low-performing schools, but I think there's sort of a disconnect in the perception of what motivates public employees and public institutions to do a good job.
Yes, go ahead, please, Sue.
Well, one of the,
Actually, Sue, before you, may I just ask, how many people would like to have something to say? Because I don't want anybody to lose the opportunity. We were planning we have about 15 minutes. We'll stay longer, but if we can close somewhere around 7:30, 7:40, we like to stay on schedule, but I want everyone to be heard. Let's do, Sue, if you wouldn't mind, could I ask some of the others that haven't asked questions? Sure. Yes.
Well, this has to do with earlier education for children. First of all, I'd like to thank you because with the Young Star rating system, you're going to go up to 5% or 25% higher, and you took out that up to, and we really appreciate that. But I know that over the next year, I think that there's a projected $24 million surplus in the Department of Children and Family Services, and I think it's mostly because we did pay less for star-rated, like 2-star rated centers and stuff. Last year, I think we had like $9 million extra surplus, and instead of it staying with the early care and education, it went to 10. And I guess I'd like to request that it stays with early education. And basically the reason for that, I think Young Star already has a system to spend that money with the ratings of the centers. And excuse me. what we're doing to get the 5-star rated centers is that we are hiring teachers with bachelor's degrees and associate's degrees, but in order to keep those, because you're talking about teachers starting out at 32,000, so we're seeing teachers with a bachelor's degree getting $12 an hour or $11 an hour, which is unacceptable. But even with that, is still, the sustainability of our businesses is collapsing because we're trying to work ahead of what they're offering us, so we're trying to get the education. Several of these centers have teach scholarships so that teachers that have been there for years are getting more education. And so we're paying, so for me personally, and I'm like a typical center that's a 4 or 5 star, I am paying teachers that have bachelor's degrees, but then I'm also paying teachers that have been with me 12 years, 18 years for teach scholarships to keep them. So between the longevity and the education, my payroll is killing me. So what I'm just asking is if we have that budget and if it's still there, if we could use that in more micro grants, like Youngstar has a micro grant right now for each person that's being rated each year, $1,000. If we could keep that, make sure that we keep that, but then if there is a surplus, if we could add that to it, you know, so that centers that want to raise their rating system, because you do need more education in this field. And so that's, I'd really like to keep that where maybe the micro grants go to the directors, you know, of those centers. So,
What's your name?
Charlotte Bogart.
Charlotte Borga, I haven't had the privilege of meeting you before, but would you mind contacting my office later, and so I can follow through in the thread that you're talking about? I'd appreciate it.
Because I'm just thinking that a lot of things we talked about, it's been a proven fact that every dollar you put into early child care, you get $7 back.
Sure.
So, and it comes back because you have less people going to prison, less people going
Sure.
on, that are getting license when they get out of high school, more students following through and finishing high school. So, I guess that's,
Less teenage pregnancy, there's all that.
yes, all of that. So, I guess that's what I just want to make sure that we were heard, but we'd like to talk to you more.
Yeah.
It will be at the legislation day next Wednesday and Thursday.
For the early childhood
Yes.
educators?
Right,
Hey, are you gonna be visiting my office?
yes.
All right, well, I can rely on that, but don't let me lose the thread of this thought. I think
Okay,
it's an
yeah.
important one.
Good idea. Maybe Bob, you could respond to that. Is that a segregated fund? Is that a fund that there would be availability to do what she's requesting?
It's funded in large part from the federal government. It's this temporary assistance to needy families, TANF monies that we get from the federal government. We basically fund a number of our W-2 programs and our child care program, and a number of others with it. And then we also have state money in it. But I understand the concern that she's raised, and I'm sure the finance committee will look at it also. You ought to be congratulated on being 5-star, by the way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
I'm not,
rare.
I don't want to miscommunicate that. I'm going for national accreditation, so I won't be 5-star till probably November or something.
Okay, well, good.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's tough.
Yep. Yes, in the back?
Yeah, I wanted to mention, you mentioned early on, Representative Hebl, that there are black people 18 to 25 in Milwaukee that don't have driver's licenses and don't have jobs. I think it was 70%, 75%.
Males.
But they were supposed to graduate from school years ago during the time that your chart is ramping up and spending lots of money per pupil. Yet we have these failing schools.
It's a perennial
So
problem.
well, it's perennial, but what does that mean? I mean, why did they fail? And what, if not trying to create a voucher system in competition, do you plan to do to get those schools up to a passing grade?
You know, it's a problem that's been permeating for literally decades. It's not something that just came about in the last 10 years. I don't have an answer. As I sit here in front of you, I am very frustrated with the Milwaukee Public Schools, especially because I wish we had, and one of the, I mean, I've talked to many educators, many administrators within the Milwaukee Public Schools as to what the solution would be. Some of them indicate that it's too big. We need to break up Milwaukee Public Schools and divided into 8 or 10 different school districts, so it's smaller, easy to manage. As I sit here with you, I don't have an answer to that. As a parent of a child who's in the Milwaukee Public Schools, if I had to choose, I want to get my child the best education possible. So in the short run, as a parent, not as a legislator, not as a policy wonk or a visionary for what the future really requires, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get my kid the best education that child can get. And it may be a voucher school. It may be a charter school. But as a parent, my role is different because my needs are immediate. As a legislator, dealing with policy, I know that the long-range future of our Wisconsin, the future here in education requires that we have a strong, viable public education system. I don't have the answer specifically to what's going to solve the Milwaukee problem. I know it's there. I know we desperately need to solve it. Tony Evers is the superintendent of public instruction. He's got some great ideas, not only on rectifying the situation there, but also in funding, in terms of funding our public education. Frankly, we made a commitment in the past to fund public education 2/3 with general revenue dollars to reduce the burden of property tax funding for education. We've not stayed up with that funding ability. We're somewhere, Bob can answer these questions right off the top of his head, but our funding is down. And so property taxpayers are paying a much higher percentage of the education bill. But I wish I could tell you, here's what we do. These 4 steps are going to rectify the problem where we no longer have a dropout rate. We no longer have 18-year-olds without driver's licenses. We don't have these problems anymore. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that question. I do know that ultimately a good education is going to be the key. I was raised here in Sun Prairie, come from a family of 17 kids. We had no money. Bottom line is our parents instilled in us that you need an education if you're ever going to have a chance. Those kids in Milwaukee, maybe it's family breakdown, maybe it's drugs, maybe it's, whatever it is. But we need to make sure that they get the help. And it's not just throwing money at the problem. We need administrators that really are visionary. I look at Milt McPike at Eastside Madison, Eastside School, and I think, God, what a great guy he was. We've got a principal at Creekside who is he's a visionary about how to deal with kids, and they do a great job. And that's what we need, of those kind of special people that can come in and see a problem and work to a solution. We have those problems here in Sun Prairie, we have in Madison, not to the extent of Milwaukee, but we need to reverse it, not continue going to the way of making our schools less and less effective. But we need to enhance their ability to change with the times and become more and more effective, because our future as a nation, as a state, is totally dependent on the quality of the education our kids get.
Without question, I agree, but throwing money at it, where we're already in the top 10 in the country for what we spend on per pupil, those bad schools had the same money. And I think we have to look at why, over the last decades and decades and decades, their ability to teach our students and keep them from failing in the system, instead of watching it deteriorate while we keep throwing money at it and doing the same old things over and over again, why don't we do something instead of just throwing the money at it?
There's one guarantee in your statement. If we stop funding those schools, they won't get better. They'll only get worse. Now, we've got a bad problem there, and we need to look at those solutions that are going to solve those problems and make sure that cancer doesn't spread to the other school systems in the area and throughout the state. And if we reduce funding as we have in this last 2-year term and continue that progression, it's not only likely, it's a guarantee that our educational systems will reduce their quality and our kids will then get a second-class education.
And I think some of the programs implemented by the Sun Prairie School District to deal with families that are living, or students that are in challenging household or neighborhood environments can be transferred over to similar school districts. You had a question or a comment?
Yeah, I had a comment. It's more on the resource side of the budget rather than the spending. Just before we walked in on a public radio program, National Public Radio, there was a study done that Wisconsin has the highest binge drinking rate in the nation, the lowest tax on alcohol. As a person who's proud of the education system of Wisconsin, we're in the top 10. It's embarrassing as a resident of Wisconsin to be on top of the binge drinking rate when we have the lowest tax on liquor and beer.
So I know the answer, and that is continue to drink and tax it. On all education.
Well, all right, thank you.
That's what you call.
Are you okay with that? You raise a valid point. We were looking at some alcohol, drunk driving related bills that are coming down the pike. And some of the impression that's being given is that we throw these violators into prison, we get rid of the problem. There is actually been a culture change over time. It's not as fast as I want to see it occur, but our heritage is part of the problem. And it's a culture that we have to change. But frankly, you know, you and your friends, and even the next generation, you'll notice that their habits have changed. Talk about somebody who's been picked up for drunk driving, and how the word spreads, how horrible that's affected their lives. And granted, we see these 8, 10, 12 repeat offenders, and it just makes you sick. And we look at the accidents, and still a majority of the fatalities and serious injuries are caused by drunk drivers. We need to solve that problem. And part of it is alcoholism is not something that's easily beat. It's a disease. And so it has to be dealt with the treatment that's required and the idea of taxing in order to pay for the cost of that treatment makes a lot of sense.
Somebody in the back had a comment, and then we'll end with Sue.
It's what you were saying, I agree with you, but I've said it all along my whole life, that I've lived in different parts of
Can you
this
speak a little louder?
Yes, I don't feel that our public school system should be financially totally responsible for all the social problems that many communities have. That we need more, that's just a general, that's basically what I want to say. We can't expect our schools to perform miracles for children who go to school hungry, mistreated at home. We do all we want in the classroom to send it back to that. So we need more money coming from other places other than schools like this, more programs.
And I think we really need more family involvement. When Russ and I and Terry went to school here in Sun Prairie back in whatever the Middle Ages, not Terry, so but 90% of the families were two-parent families. Only one of the parents worked. You know, now over 50% of the families in Sun Prairie are single-parent families. My wife is a school nurse at Eastside School. She's not a nurse only. She's a psychologist. She's a teacher. She's a, she does all the nutritionist. I mean, the roles that we ask our teachers and staff to do at schools is just mind-boggling. And so I have the greatest respect for our educators in this city and in the state. So your point is very well taken, that it takes a community to raise a child. It takes a community to educate a child. Sue, it looks like you get the last, no, but before we do that, anybody else? We're going to save you for the other. Yes.
Is there any support for alternative energy vehicles, rebates for purchase of such vehicles?
With these two guys, there is. With the current administration, probably not so much.
I'll work on it.
Yep. No,
Also, and focus on energy. Is there any state money coming in for focus on energy, or is that all utility funded?
I don't know about it.
It's utility funded.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
We need another meeting to discuss healthcare.
Yes, all right. Well, I mean, remember, Mark's office, my office is always open. We don't need to wait for a meeting for you to give me a call, or give Mark a call and say, these are my concerns about healthcare. Because, as you know, Mark and I are both very strong advocates for healthcare. Mark has been one of the leading proponents for single-payer healthcare for a lot of years. And long term, we know that healthcare is something we have to have. All right, we've waited long enough.
Oh, I just wanted to say the tax on beer hasn't been increased since 1968.
68, 69.
I don't know how you can talk about schools in Milwaukee without talking about lack of jobs and poverty. Poverty is creating a problem in Milwaukee. Schools won't solve that, although early childhood education will help. I was just going to point out under transportation the fact that part of the new bonding is going to come from selling off state buildings, including potentially 37 heating and power plants. I think that's a pretty loathsome proposal and very dangerous, that we privatize utilities so that we will all pay more and not have the regulation that we need. And then I was curious to know why the Office of Justice Assistance functions are all being transferred primarily over to Department of Justice. Maybe this is just an efficiency thing, I don't know, but there must be some rationale for why the burn grants and the treatment alternative and violence against women all goes under the Department of Justice.
I don't have a response from Mark or Rob.
I can't answer the last question.
I can't give you the rationale. I can just say that there are a number of programs that get a variety of surcharges that come in for various penalties, and there's burn money, as you indicated, that the Office of Justice Assistance has run, and some of those are also the Attorney General's office is involved with, so the governor, I'm sure, just decided to take it out of the Department of Administration, Office of Justice Assistance, and move them over. What did you say before that? What was your point before the Office of Justice Assistance?
Selling off.
Oh, the utility. Yeah, I wanted to make a point about that. Okay, it was really portrayed, you know, in the press before the budget came out, that it would allow for the sale of those 37 power plants that we have. And the language in the bill is much broader than that. It really allows for the sale of virtually all state-owned buildings. It's much broader than just the power plants, and sort of sold to pay the debt off on transportation bonds, but there's no real direct link between those two things. So the debt will be paid as it currently is by vehicle registration or the state's general fund, and if there is a sale of an asset, let's say you take a building, the first draw is to pay off the debt on that building. So we got a $50 million building and we owe 20 in debt, we paid that off. But the residual would sort of go into the state treasury, sort of marked for debt service, but there's no direct link. But my point is just, it's broader than 37 power plants. It's significantly broader than that. The authority to allow the Department of Administration and the Building Commission to sell or lease state-owned buildings is very broad.
Yes, Mary.
As a follow-up to that, isn't it true that, take as an example, One West Wilson, where I worked, if they sold that building, which is right on the lake, that whoever the new owner would be, would turn around and rent it back to the state at a higher rate per square foot for renting in that building, for use of that building? Is that true or not? I mean, is it?
Well,
And
I
then
think
make that up in my mind.
I mean, I think if somebody's gonna buy a building, you or I or any of us would buy a building, we wouldn't do so probably without seeing some kind of return come back on that property, whether it's a individually owned home or an apartment or whatever else we've got. And I assume the same thing is gonna happen with someone who would wanna come in and purchase a building and decide.
And many of those buildings are already paid off, I would assume. I mean, One West Wilson's been around forever.
I would hope we've got One West Wilson paid off.
I would hope so.
Well, the policy question is, does it make sense to sell off the public asset for the cash inflow and then lease it back,
Yeah.
yeah, and to me, it strikes me as a very short-sighted policy in order to try and continue to balance the budget without raising the sort of ongoing revenue that you need to pay for the things, but instead just sort of selling off assets in order to be able to balance the budget. Now, that's obviously my cynical view of it, but that's the way I look at it. And I want to thank everybody for coming out today. This has been one of the liveliest discussions that we've had in these various meetings, and I really congratulate you for your interest and for the good questions that you asked and the observations you had. And I particularly want to thank Director Lang. He doesn't do this very often, and so I
also want to thank you all for being here, and without you, we couldn't have this listening session. So again, it doesn't end tonight. There's information about both Mark and my office, and please, if you have any questions or continuing concerns, as we all do, don't hesitate to contact our office. That's our job, is to protect your interests. So again, thank you very much for being here today.